Right, welcome back to the intern game plan. So we finished stage one, we're now on to stage two. Stage one was pre-application. Now this is stage two. You've got to stand out, you've got to make the shortlist. This is like the automated stage. Now to do this, you've really kind of got to overcome a couple of barriers. The first is the online test stage. Not all firms have this, most firms do. And the second is a video interview stage. Now in this video, we're going to be talking about the online tests. I'm going to hopefully be writing up blogs on how to tackle the situational judgment test, essentially just following a formula of different behaviors. You've got to make sure that each kind of optimal strategy you're choosing, because it's kind of a situational multiple choice questionnaire, each strategy adheres to all those different characteristics. That's fine, I think that's best for a blog, but this one is probably the video I'm most excited for. It's something that I really wish I had like last year, but you only really gauge an insight into if you've done the most recent application season. And it's not covering like every single possible test there is, but I think it pretty much covers at least 80% of the tests I had to do. And that is kind of which tests overlap. So the key thing is online tests are hard, they're difficult. Numerical tests, verbal reasoning tests, situational judgment tests, as well as verbal, you also have logical reasoning tests, inductive reasoning tests. These psychometric tests are there to knock out as many applicants as possible because it is costly and it takes a lot of time to interview and review every candidate. Most people get knocked out at this stage, so do not underestimate this stage, and do not underestimate the competition at this stage. Many people, and I'm never going to advocate this, many people cheat in this stage, and that is going to naturally boost up the marks. So you've got to be really strategic in how you approach this. Now what I suggest you do is that you use every single opportunity you undertake an online test as a practice round to prepare you for the next one. And even more specific than that, you realise that actually some tests are exactly the same. Some tests use the same provider, they use the same case study within that provider, and that happens strangely more often than you think. And I'm going to break down my understanding of what this was like or what this looked like last year. So the first provider you may have heard of, you may or may not have heard of, is called CUTI. And they also call them Aon, because I think Aon makes the CUTI tests, and it's the financial pack within that. In fact, there's only one company that doesn't use a financial pack of all the companies that use CUTI and Aon. So the companies that use this package includes RBC, which is Royal Bank of Canada, Morgan Stanley. By the way, the Morgan Stanley kind of threshold for passing is like extremely high. If you get a report afterwards, if you are very fast and very accurate, you probably still won't pass it. You need to be extremely fast and extremely accurate. And the only way you're going to do that relative to everyone else who's undertaking the test, who has also practiced massively, is being very familiar and very kind of you've optimized your strategy. You've got to be the best of the best to be able to pass that. So that was Royal Bank of Canada, Morgan Stanley, Nomura, again a very high threshold for Nomura, and also Credit Suisse. Credit Suisse, again, super high threshold. There are also other factors, and then BNP Paribas. BNP Paribas, they use a kind of infrastructure package, so it's a slightly different case study that they'll use, or industrial package, at least when I did it. But again, very similar skills, same interface. You can find these examples of CUTI online on Aon. I recommend trying out Job Test Prep. I really use them a lot. Also Assessment Day are useful, but ultimately even better than Job Test Prep, even better than Assessment Day, is actually like when you're doing the RBC test, that is a practice for the next CUTI test is going to come up, because RBC for me was the first one that opened out of that whole list. Then it was Morgan Stanley, then it was Nomura, then it was Credit Suisse, and then it was BNP Paribas. So that's just like the ordering you kind of got to keep in mind. So that's the CUTI Aon section. Then we move on to the next test providers, which is Korn Ferry, also known as Talent Q. I have no idea why they've got two of the same name. It's very confusing, but anyway, maybe it's just to confuse you even more. That's something they would probably want to do. So within this, we have another very, kind of like standardized set of firms that just use the same test. This includes Royal Bank of Scotland, including NatWest. And if you've done their spring, it's going to be exactly the same as your Korn Ferry test for the summer internships. And that was actually an interesting one because the NatWest spring opened for applications in May, and then a lot of these tests were coming in through August and September. So that was like a really useful preparation for the internship programs, even though that was a spring from the first year. So again, thinking very strategically about this. And this is why I can't advocate or emphasize enough how important it is to really go through that spring process and practice. But if you haven't done that, don't get stressed. But you know, if you're in that position, really do relish that opportunity. If you haven't gone through that position, it's still very possible. It's just going to require that diligence. It's going to require that consistency to get you up to speed. So within Talent Q and Korn Ferry, we have, as I said, RBS and NatWest. Also UBS have a very tough situational judgment test, which is the situational judgment is usually isolated from the kind of the other commonalities, like the verbal reasoning and the numerical reasoning. They're the same across the board as I'm listing here. Situational judgment, usually a bit different, and I'm going to be talking about that in the blog post. And we also have Standard Chartered. They have the same Korn Ferry or Talent Q tests. City, again, exactly the same. And you know, their logical reasoning test is exactly the same. That is City, Standard Chartered, RBS have exactly the same logical reasoning test. UBS have a slightly different one. And if you do their practice test, you'll be able to see, just get a hint of, you know, which type of logical reasoning test, because there are usually variations in terms of which Korn Ferry, Talent Q logical reasoning test they've opted for, the HR have opted for. And you know, the best thing for that is just going on assessment day, going on job test prep, and experimenting, you know, checking which ones align closest to that practice test before you do the real thing. Okay, so those are, you know, the Cutty and the Korn Ferry. They're probably the two that have the most firms with exactly the same test. Then we bring in a few curveballs. Okay, so a few more difficult tests, very, very tailored to each individual firm, very different. You know, you can't really do much to prepare for this unless you really kind of do the spring process and prepare ahead of that. For example, we have job simulators. This includes Barclays and HSBC. Now, the reason why I was able to perform well on the Barclays test was that in my first year of university, I applied to the Barclays Spring. And because I reflected on that Barclays Spring kind of application, I wrote loads of notes of how I was going to improve next time. And I wrote like what I would have said in the interview if I could have done it again. I was able to, a whole year later, in that summer internship application, I was able to apply that feedback and obviously kind of stand out and, you know, kind of give it my best shot in that way. HSBC, they have and again, so Barclays and HSBC with this situation, with this kind of job simulator, so you're simulating, it's a day in the life of that investment banker. The first stage is usually a kind of situational judgment test. You've got different situations, how would you act, what is your optimal behavior, and then the second layer is really kind of a more advanced, maybe some video interview aspects, maybe you have to show the camera, maybe it's some kind of numerical aspects, some numerical questions, maybe it's a bit of writing, a bit of reporting, and it's kind of layering those two aspects together. HSBC, just remember for this one, just a very kind of random point, remember to scroll to the bottom of the page for each like case study, because I forgot to do that on one of the pages. There's quite a lot of information and there was a big gap in one of the areas of the screen. Just make sure you scroll to the bottom of the page, you take a brief scan and then you digest it. Again, familiarity is your key. Use that spring application process as your greatest asset ahead of the internship process. No application is gone to waste. Sometimes it's the application process itself that is more valuable than even having the spring and not, you know, converting that spring. So really important to take that as your greatest asset. We also have a few other anomalies. So I'm gonna, particularly the boutiques like to do it their own way, which is completely fine. You just gotta know how to you know, approach this. So Perella Weinberg Partners, after the second round interview, they had a test which was pretty much just GCSE maths questions. So very problem solving. If any of you did the 1 to 9 maths GCSE, it was very much a problem solving type of basis, like very kind of applicable to the real world. That just completely filled the PWP test. Just prepare maybe some of those past papers, like getting used to that thinking. Torch Partners and Gleacher Shacklock use Fresh Minds, which is a recruitment agency, and they use Mapped B applied tests. That's just, that test I didn't find too difficult. The practice tests were very good for that. There's nothing too stressful about that. That usually came, I think, after the first round interview. Moelis used Test Partnership and see Assessment Day for that. Assessment Day have some great practice for Test Partnership. Even more importantly, the practice on the Test Partnership website is very, very important. And there was one question, I really regret this, that was all about kind of the 1 to n ratio, and like it was kind of using that, applying it in a very kind of difficult context, which is fine if you have enough time. The biggest challenge with these tests is timing. You just can't think fast enough if you haven't kind of geared up yourself, if you haven't like kind of warmed up properly, you know what's coming. So really focus on like kind of those niche, maybe 1-to-n ratio questions in that practice test for MOLIS. You know, I messed that up, and I messed that up twice within the test because like, you know, I just kind of got flustered the first time round. But again, if you reflect afterwards, that won't happen again. The next thing is PJT partners. So here we're going to bring in, it's a bit weird, there's a kind of a suited test they use, a suited assessment. This is another external company that have created something. They're all trying to kind of automate, you know, the tests, testing your personality, your characteristics. This one wasn't too difficult in terms of practicing. I would just say that the suited assessments are, you know, kind of like, were sometimes very repetitive in terms of having to, you know, memorize a sequence of letters in that sense, trying to see what type of personality you'd embody. There's not too much you can really prepare for that. And also we have, you know, various other kind of companies like JP Morgan who have Psychometric, also used by Blackstone, which is again another kind of gamified assessment. So there's not much you can do to prepare for that. A lot of people stress over that. I think there are other application components you need to prioritize rather than getting stressed over something that's very hard to practice. We have like Rothschild have their own numerical test. I would just use the SHL test package in job test prep for that. EY, again, another situational kind of simulator, just like HSBC and Barclays. PwC, exactly the same thing. Now, the EY situational judgment test was very tough. I would again, you know, refer to that blog post I'm going to be releasing on the kind of criteria to follow with your situational judgment test. I think Job Test Prep have a very good example with this in one of their PDFs. You know, the situational judgment hack is not just to go with your gut feeling, but to really think carefully about, you know, what is the, you know, evaluating what is the most effective action here that is going to have the least damage for the firm. It's very hard to juggle. It is easier said than done. It is one of the most difficult, challenging tests. And the reason for that, and the reason why it knocks so many people out, is because people underestimate it. So that's a really tough one, especially just jumping back to UBS. I failed their situational judgment test. Their situational judgment test was very tailored towards sales and trading, right? So I wasn't used to the sales and trading kind of protocols or rules. Now, you may say a lot of them are obvious, but when you get into the nitty-gritty of some of the situations, it's not as obvious. And so again, you know, having that guide and being diligent in like kind of keeping to that guide, those criteria of those behaviors you're avoiding and those behaviors you are trying to emulate will hopefully help you with that. PwC, as I said, exactly the same. It's another job simulator. I would just say PwC, there's one game with a padlock. You may have heard of this. Do not continue trying to solve that padlock game. It is impossible. They're trying to test, one, if you're persistent. Fine, most people are persistent in that, but they're probably going to be too persistent. So you can't be too persistent. Go for a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes, I don't know, 3 minutes, and then stop. You know, that should kind of pass you on that criteria. So that's a breakdown. It's probably quite a lot to take in. A lot of this, you know, it could change. It probably won't change because I found from my spring to internship application process, very little changed. It was very rare for these HR teams to, it was very unlikely for this to be the 1 in 7 or 1 in 10 years for them to change their system. So just be prepared for that, but you know, prepare where you can. Something else, and this links to video interviews, really kind of like using software that's going to help you reflect. For example, for video interviews, you've probably done this. You maybe use your camera and you record yourself with a video interview, and then you can kind of see afterwards, how would I sound in the actual interview. And perhaps in a normal automated video interview, you might use a software like a recording software. You know, a lot of lecturers in this environment use something called open broadcast software, and that can really kind of help you reflect after you've kind of done a practice video interview, or you've done one of those automated video interviews. You can reflect on your experience really well. And again, those kind of pieces of software are just going to help you facilitate that reflection process. At the heart of this game plan, it is consistency and really kind of, you know, you're at a certain stage, you're trying to beat yourself. It's like playing golf. You're trying to get better and better and better against yourself, and thereby creating that competitive advantage. Online tests are hard, they're not easy, and it's not the funnest part of the application component, but it is where the most amount of people get knocked out, and you know, it just really harms your chances in terms of this being a numbers game. You've got to try and jump over as many hurdles as you possibly can, because the more places you get to that final round interview, 100% the more likely you're going to be able to get an offer. It is most people get knocked out early on, so just treat this really kind of with a lot of diligence, with a lot of care, and be patient in your preparation with it.